So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these objections rapid fire style. So Dr. Farris, I'm only giving him 60 seconds to answer.
60 seconds? Okay, I'll try to match that. Hey, we're back at it again. If the thumbnail gave you the wrong impression, no, today we're not addressing the 10 objections to the soul, but rather addressing Capturing Christianity's video where Dr. Farris does. So today we're objecting to Dr. Farris's objections to the 10 objections to the notion of a soul. This sounded a lot better on paper, I swear. Anyway, here we go.
Let's go ahead and start with the first one, the interaction problem. Critics argue that dualism struggles to explain how the immaterial mind and the material body interact, such as how mental events can cause physical actions. How do you respond to this one?
Great. Well, in short, the answer to the objection is there is no interaction problem. And I think this is as philosophers have said, the most overrated objection to position in the history of philosophy. And that's because once we take seriously the mind, mental events, mental properties, they are non-reducible to physical and neural properties. And so you have to make sense of the bridge already between these events and properties. So what's a problem for all is a problem for none. And this applies to dualism.
Yeah, but the bridge only proves the connection between the brain states, which are material events, and the mind, which is the actual mental representation of those said brain states. The bridge does not show the connection between brain states and the soul. Dualism claims that the body and the soul are separate entities and that they work in conjunction, so you need to prove what work means. If you claim that the soul does not interact with the body, so the material plane, at all, then you have no reason to believe it even exists. If it does, you need to show evidence of its interaction with the material plane, which in this case is the brain. And you can't point at the mind as being that evidence because the mind is the emergent property of the brain's different states, so you need something else, unless you claim that the mind is the soul, in which case your position is even worse, because you now have identified the soul as being an emergent property of the brain, which evolves with the individual, degrades over time, can change due to traumatic brain events and diseases, and as evidence indicates, ceases to exist when the individual dies. And since we're discussing the soul in a specific religious context, such an idea is contradictory to that of an indestructible, eternal, and unchangeable immaterial identity. The objection stays.
Okay, so number 2, Occam's razor. Some philosophers contend that dualism introduces unnecessary complexity by positing 2 fundamental substances when a monist approach, like physicalism, could explain the same phenomena with just one.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting objection, and it seems to be motivated by an intuition itself. But the question is, can it actually capture all the phenomena? Can it make sense of all the phenomena? That's the real question. If it doesn't, then this sort of Occam's razor or principle of simplicity doesn't actually apply or justify or make sense of physicalism or some version of monism being a better alternative to dualism. And I would suggest, based upon the features of qualia, the features of intentionality, the privacy of the mental, that these monist views do not make sense of those, and so this objection doesn't really hold water against dualism.
This is a misrepresentation of what Occam's razor does. The goal of Occam's razor isn't to provide an explanation to a given event, but to highlight redundant explanations. What remains isn't the correct explanation, but the likeliest one given all the evidence. Your entire point is that if Occam's razor cannot definitely explain the phenomena of consciousness through monism, then dualism is true or likely true, which is a shift of the burden of proof. You're basically postulating the truth of dualism and ask Occam's razor to disprove it. Then you have the problem of the false dichotomy, because your position is that the alternative to monism is dualism. I say you have a third option, which is that the soul doesn't exist. Instead, our reality is the projection of another self that exists in an extra-dimensional matrix, and our mind is the connection between both worlds. How exactly have you removed this possibility so that you can embrace the soul as the only explanation? The beauty of Occam's razor is that it rejects both of these hypotheses until proven, and instead remains with the simplest and most obvious option: the mind is a product of the brain, and there's no good reason to consider any other theory beyond that. And if your position is, yeah, but relying on Occam's razor alone doesn't mean you can solve the problem of consciousness, and I agree. But what you're left with isn't therefore the soul, but rather therefore I have no explanation. Full stop. And believe me, this holds sufficient water. This objection stays. Dr. Farris uses 2 points to tackle the following objection, so let's take them one at a time.
Let's go ahead and move on to number 3, lack of empirical evidence. So this objection says that dualism is criticized for lacking empirical evidence that can support the existence of immaterial minds or souls. So you got no evidence.
This is an interesting objection, but I think it confronts the problem of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, of which we have numerous accounts and reports for, that logically, if they're true, presuppose something like a soul, something other than the body, that makes my existence or me persist beyond the body itself.
You basically said that this objection is problematic because if out-of-body or near-death experiences were true, then that would prove that something persists beyond the death of the body, which would invalidate the objection because you would have empirical evidence. Except you've admitted that out-of-body and near-death experiences haven't been proven to be true yet. Until proven otherwise, we have no reason to believe that they're nothing more than brain states caused by the brain itself when subjected to specific stressors, such as the boost in serotonin and the spike in gamma brainwaves in the moment preceding death. So you can't use out-of-body and near-death experiences to invalidate this objection, since you've admitted yourself that they haven't been proven to be true. And since this is the only example, to put it like that, of empirical evidence for dualism, I'll assume you have none, because if you did, you would have provided it.
And it furthermore raises the question about the adequacy of empirical science as the primary or only means by which we can arrive at truth.
By which we can arrive at the empirical truth, I think you meant to say. We use empirical science to test and investigate the empirical universe. If you claim that the soul has empirical and measurable effects, then we obviously rely on empirical science to assess the said effects. If you claim that the soul doesn't produce empirical and measurable effects, then empirical methodology cannot do that. So you need to propose another investigative technique. You can also propose an alternative to empirical science itself as a tool to investigate the empirical world, if you think that the empirical science is too limited. Until you do that, this objection stays too.
Objection number 4, dependency on the brain. This is a big one. Evidence from neuroscience suggests that mental processes and consciousness are closely tied to brain activity, challenging dualist separation of mind and body. What is your response?
This is one of the reasons advanced in favor of some form of monism, and I think it's an intuitive sort of objection. But I think it only works if we assume that the mind isn't real, that we eliminate the mind, or we assume some sort of identity physicalist thesis that minds literally are identical to brain states or neural events. But neuroscientists themselves don't even make that assumption. They presume some kind of dualism, oftentimes in their writings about neural events and mental events, as if they are simply distinct. Certainly there are different types of or notions of dependence of the mind on the brain that would commonsensically make sense of the fact that brain effects actually do impact the mind itself or the soul, like when I hit my head on the dashboard of the car upon a collision with another car. This makes sense of that fact if I have a view of mind-on-brain dependence. But that's true on both physicalism as well as dualism. So at the end of the day, I don't think this is really an objection to dualism.
Okay, this was a longer and more convoluted answer than it should have been, so let me rephrase what Dr. Farris actually said. This objection only works if you assume that either the mind doesn't exist or that the mind is the same as brain states, but the mind does exist and it is separate, albeit dependent from the brain states, just as the soul. And because this objection doesn't hold water against the separation of brain and mind, it doesn't hold water against the separation of body and soul. Listen, I'll tell you right now, it was way more difficult to summarize this point than I originally thought it would be. Fortunately, it was considerably easier to visualize and write the rebuttal, which is this. Dr. Farris either treats the mind and the soul as synonyms here.
Brain effects actually do impact the mind itself or the soul.
Or believes that the soul is an extension of the mind, which is why whatever affects the mind also affects the soul. It's unclear from how he phrased it, but I think these are the two possible explanations. Whatever the case may be, his rebuttal doesn't hold water, because this objection isn't aimed at the separation between the body and the mind, but at the separation between the body and the soul. And you cannot attack the objection by showing that the mind is indeed separate, albeit impacted, by the brain. You need to show that for the soul instead, and you didn't. Instead, your reasoning process went something like this. This objection attacks A, the idea of the separation of the body and mind. However, A is true, the body and mind are separate. Therefore, this isn't a real objection against A, the separation of body and mind. Therefore, this isn't a real objection against B, the separation of body and soul. Even if this line of reasoning was correct, 4 still didn't follow. But this line of reasoning isn't even correct because, as I've shown, the objection attacks B, not A. The objection stays.
All right, let's move on to number 5. Problem of causal closures. I see this on X a lot. Physicalism proponents argue that if everything has a physical cause, dualism's non-physical mind would be unable to influence the physical world. So how do you respond to the idea of causal closure?
Kim says, quote, any physical event that has a cause at time t has a physical cause at time t, end quote. But this, of course, raises the question about the natural world and whether or not it's closed, and everything is comprehensively explained by physical events, laws, and underlying physical particles. I doubt that. I reject that thesis, and I think for the reasons that, well, in fact, we do have reasons, and our minds have access to those reasons that transcend physical explanations in the world. In other words, naturalism is an insufficient explanation for all that's going on in the world, and we need minds and we need reasons. But if those are true and they're not deterministically caused, then something else is going on beyond the principle of physical causal closure that explains all that occurs in the world.
While I agree that the principle of causal closure makes a statement of absolute knowledge, which is why I cannot accept it as valid, I also disagree with your statement naturalism is an insufficient explanation for all that's going on in the world, for the exact same reason. You cannot know that naturalism is an insufficient explanation for the world. Maybe it is, it's just that we haven't yet discovered all of its mechanisms. The second problem is with the claim that if the mind is true, which it is, and it's not deterministically caused, which at the very least appears to be, then, quote, something else is going on beyond the principle of causal closure that explains all that occurs in the world. I agree with the statement, but do you notice the conclusion? To reward it in simpler terms, if the mind is not deterministically caused, then naturalism cannot explain its nature. But you need the conclusion to be, if the mind is not deterministically caused, then the soul exists, religion is true, God is real, and the afterlife is an actual place. And you'll need to make an unjustified leap to get there, sort of like the proponents of the Kalam cosmological argument who take the conclusion of the argument, therefore the universe has a cause, and unjustifiably add, and that cause is an eternal, omniscient, omnipotent God, and you can learn everything about him in this specific book. While this objection has its flaw because it claims absolute knowledge, your counter to it suffers from the same flaw. Fortunately, the causal closure argument can be redeemed if it turns into we have no good evidence to believe that physical things have causes other than physical. Your argument cannot be. So the objection stays.
So number 6 is it's called evolutionary perspective. So basically critics argue that dualism doesn't align well with our understanding of human evolution and the development of consciousness. So how do you respond to that?
So what's the real concern here? Is it the idea that the churchlings have stated that ghosts, disembodied spirits, angels, gods, things of these sorts are spooky forces that have no place in a scientific picture of the world? Is that the concern? Well, then I would just suggest that there's probably more going on than the scientific picture that they've assumed. Is it the concern of the principle of physical causal closure? We've already dealt with that. I think there's more to be said here about the fittingness, maybe. Maybe that's the concern. How is it that souls fit in biological evolution? And I think basically, we have no good reason, no a priori reason or empirical reason for rejecting something like psychophysical laws, that there are actually laws that govern the interaction of minds with bodies. And if we don't have any good reasons to reject that interaction, then it doesn't seem like there's any good reason to reject dualism as incompatible with an evolutionary perspective.
There is actually good reason, and that good reason is the lack of evidence. This is also the reason why we reject the notion of ghosts and spirits that Dr. Farris mentioned in his response. The fact that you have a mind interacting with the physical body, aka the brain, isn't evidence that the mind is a separate entity from the body, can exist past the body's expiration date, that God exists, heaven is real, and religion is true. I understand that Farris doesn't explicitly claim these things, but that's what he actually believes, and it's what feeds the notion of soul that he supports. So, in reality, it appears as if the mind is nothing more than the direct result of brain activity. It's not conclusive, but all the evidence points towards this conclusion, which is why we can no longer detect the mind once the brain is dead. What is the mind's actual nature and how does it work? I don't know. But the answer is I don't know, not so. This objection stays too.
Objection number 7, problem of identity. So dualism faces questions regarding the identity of the mind and soul over time, especially in cases of amnesia, or brain damage, or other mental disorders.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. There's a lot of data on this, and I would just push back and say that these are complex, challenging concerns for both the physicalist as well as the dualist. But if dualism is true and the identity of persons is predicated of some simple thing, then dualism supplies a kind of natural explanation as to how it is that I could exist or persist, even though the complexities of my body and my brain change over time. And we know that. We can look at brain damage. We can look at amnesia as well as other cases like dementia. But this doesn't really seem to undermine dualism. It just provides a complicated case for both physicalists and dualists. Certainly, if we have a robust view of mind-on-brain dependence or functional dependence, then we can make sense of the fact that there is such a thing as physical malfunctioning, brain malfunctioning, that actually affects the structure of the mind itself and how it is that we experience the world. This isn't really a problem.
Your argument is a problem though. I've had to listen to Dr. Farris's answer several times because he uses a very convoluted way of expressing his thoughts for some reason, and I think the actual problem is here.
These are complex, challenging concerns for both the physicalist as well as the dualist. But if dualism is true, then dualism supplies a kind of natural explanation as to how it is that I could exist or persist, even though the complexities of my body and my brain change over time.
Except this isn't true. Your identity actually doesn't persist in cases of severe brain damage and brain disease, among other things. We identify you as the same person out of convenience, of course, but your identity is different. A person with psychosis or multiple personality disorder has a different mental identity than the same person prior to those illnesses. Not to mention, the person's identity evolves naturally over time anyway, which is why the same individual will not express the same emotional, intellectual, and psychological identity at 13 compared to 40. And this isn't the problem for physicalists who claim that the body and mind are connected and one influences the other, which furthermore supports the idea that the mind dies along with the brain. But it is a problem for dualists who claim that the soul is separate from the body, basically undetermined, so it cannot be influenced by the body's malfunctions, how you put it, and that it outlasts the body basically forever. The objection stays.
So objection number 8, we've got 3 more. Problem of other minds. It's challenging to verify the existence of other minds or souls, leading to skepticism about dualism's claims.
The problem of other minds is not a metaphysical problem or objection. The fact that I have access to my own mental states and you have access to your own mental states and you don't have direct access to my mental states, it doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, it might be an epistemic concern or challenge that I lack certain reasons or justification that other minds exist, but there's different ways to respond. One is just to say that, well, it's an inference to the best explanation based upon your communication, your behavior, that you are a mind or have a mind. The other way is just to respond that commonsensically, when my cognitive faculties are reliably functioning, they just do produce the belief that you are a mind or that you have a mind, and that seems sufficient. The fact that I have a second personal encounter, a meaningful encounter with another person, seems sufficient for the belief or for the justification that I know that you are, in fact, a person.
I have nothing against Dr. Farris here, as I believe he's 100% correct in what he's saying. This is essentially the problem of hard solipsism, which claims that your mind is the only thing you can objectively know to exist. Everything else is a projection of your own mind. This is an unfalsifiable position, and until proven, is just a meaningless philosophical game. This objection goes. Hey, would you look at that? I can keep it under 60 seconds.
So number 9 is another one of these really interesting objections. So it's the problem of location. Dualism struggles to explain where the mind or soul is located or how it relates to specific parts of the body. Just to kind of expand on that one a little bit, this one isn't in our notes, but there's a mutual friend of ours, Parker Sedecase, and he often likes to ask the question, could God have put my soul into my desk? And that's sort of related here, the problem of location. How do you respond?
This may be a problem of conceivability, but there seems to be a more fundamental or deeper metaphysical issue that David Hume raises about the nature of causation in the world. Why is it that the billiard ball hits another billiard ball? What's the causal relation? Is it a brute cause? Is it a brute force? Or is it some just sort of causally contiguous relation? This is a problem for both physicalists as well as dualists. And dualists do have other things to say about this. They do have other things to say about why it is that this soul is spatial or causally efficacious in this spatial location. One is just to say that there's a brute, singular, or basic relation that my soul has to my body, and that's sufficient. God set it up that way. That's all we need to say. Other dualists have different answers. Some would say that the soul is actually located. It's located in this body. It's simple. It's not spatially extended, but nonetheless it is spatial, and this deflates the concerns or the conceivability of how this soul could causally interact with this body at this place.
I agree with Dr. Farris here as well. The objection pretty much goes something like, how is it that only humans appear to have souls? How is it that desks don't have them? This is convenient, isn't it? To which Dr. Farris responds, well, because God made it that way. Or, the soul is a property of the human body, sort of like consciousness is. And these are both legitimate answers in a purely rationalizing context. Naturally, the problem is that both these answers need proving before being accepted as true. However, the argument transpiring from the problem of location is, it doesn't make sense that souls only inhabit humans and not inanimate objects. Therefore, it's unjustified to believe that soul exists. And here the conclusion simply doesn't follow. Dr. Farris explained why quite well. This objection goes too.
So number 10 is lack of a coherent explanation. So some people argue that dualism doesn't provide a sort of satisfactory explanation for various mental phenomena like memory, emotions, and perception. How do you respond?
Yeah, this is quite a complicated set of issues, and I would say that it's quite complicated for both monists as well as dualists of varying brands. But I would also push back and say that dualists have done some work on this. Dualists have tried to make sense of both memory and perception in various ways.
I'll stop Dr. Farris here because after this point all he's doing is explain how some dualists have proposed some explanations regarding the relationship between the soul and various mental phenomena, but I don't care about that. One, because those are simply proposed theories, not actual evidence, and two, because this objection fails without assuming those anyway. That's because this objection assumes that so long as you don't have a comprehensive understanding of a given phenomenon, then the phenomenon doesn't exist. But this is false. We can observe and analyze a phenomenon and accept that it's real, even if we can't explain absolutely everything about it. Black holes would be a good example among numerous others. The problem, of course, is that we cannot observe and analyze the soul. I'm just saying that using the argument, you cannot explain every single thing about the interaction between the soul and the mind, therefore we have no reason to believe that the soul exists, is a bad argument in and of itself. So this objection goes too. To close on a high note, Dr. Farris got 3 right out of 10, but it doesn't matter. Dr. Farris could have disproved all of the 10 objections and it wouldn't have made one bit of a difference for his case. That's because Dr. Farris believes that the soul exists, and this video of him tackling these 10 objections is his way of saying, I believe that the soul exists, so let's look at your 10 best attempts to disprove it, which is a banal shift of the burden of proof. In reality, Dr. Farris has the burden of proof. He needs to prove that the soul exists, not expect others to disprove it. And even if he can decisively dismantle all of the objections against his proposed theory, this doesn't bring his theory any closer to being true. What more can I say here other than like, subscribe and share my video if you want to see content like this in the future. Yeah, who am I lying? I'll still produce content like this even if you don't support it, because I simply love doing it. Some support would be nice though. Peace.